So this week's episode was another interview. I really, really enjoyed it. It's actually with one of our outsourcing contractors, Fred. So we asked him lots of questions on his perspective of working as a Filipino in the construction industry. We went through a little bit about his journey of coming through and understanding how the UK market works. But I think the real gems in today's episode was really when we got into the depths of the kind of the cultural challenges that Filipinos and overseas workers may have when working in for UK-based companies, and as owners of construction companies, perhaps some of the mindset changes we can have, some of the slight differences and approaches that we can implement in our businesses that really, really go a long way in not only getting better productivity from your team, but also just having a better environment, and an environment where everybody in your team, whether they're working on site, they're working in your UK-based office, or if they're overseas, are actually having a good time when they're working. So I hope you enjoy. So today I wanted to introduce you, Fred, to represent the nation of the Philippines. A lot of pressure on you. No, I'm joking. But you are from the Philippines, right? You work in the construction industry. You work for UK-based companies.
Yes.
The reason I made that joke about you sort of representing the country is because I wanted to have this conversation with you in a recorded fashion, to kind of ask you about the point of view of you working as an overseas worker for UK-based company or an American-based company, whichever your base is. And I'll ask you kind of questions. Arthur will ask you questions, and it would be great if you gave us some perspective from your point of view, but obviously also just as a general view of Filipino culture and stuff like that. And obviously I'm focusing mainly on the Philippines because that's where you're from, and that's where we as a business have most experience in kind of and actually I'm going to say I think Filipinos are the best when it comes to working.
Well,
Yeah, I really do. I've had experience working with people from lots of different countries in an overseas manner, but I just have always found that it works. And maybe we can get into some of those cultural things
sure.
as why. But can we find out or give the listeners a bit of background on your journey into getting into like digital work and working away from building sites in the Philippines and into kind of working virtually? How did that come about for you?
Okay. So I think it was a few years back, 2 to 3 years ago, when COVID hit. Majority of the companies in the Philippines stopped working altogether. Most of the Filipinos transitioned to working remotely and for foreign clients because there's no income coming in for most families. And I would say this crisis turned into an opportunity because during the pandemic, it became the how to say this? It became the norm to select a remote work over a traditional base work. So even though the
Yeah.
COVID has ended, the quarantines has lifted off, majority of Filipinos still remain as working remotely, and somehow even up to today, we are still picking working from home as our preferable choice over coming back to the office doing the what we are doing 5 to 10 years ago.
And is that because is the money better? Is that because the lifestyle is better? Or obviously this is generalization and everyone's situation is different, but what's it for you actually, firstly, and then do you think that answer applies to a lot of other people as well?
Yes, I think the two main factors that you mentioned about the lifestyle and the money, it became more obvious and more apparent as people have been working through, uh, you know, uh, remotely with work from home setup. Because I think what opens the gateway of opting for work from home status is that Filipinos just wanted income despite working at home, and then suddenly lots of money are coming in. They notice that the pay is higher in comparison with the local companies here in the Philippines. And for a more obvious reason, working at home opened up an avenue for them to, take care of their families, have more free time, especially with the commuting out of the equation. Especially traffic here in the Philippines is, I think, one of the worst in Southeast Asia. So we're probably ranking around the second or third in the worst, traffic. So working from home, really, I would say it created a higher level of lifestyle overall for most Filipinos because of the time, the money, and then an opportunity, of course, to work internationally.
And I recall reading an article about, especially in the Philippines, that it was quite common not too long ago, and maybe still now, where you'd have these hubs of employment within different cities in the Philippines, but people were dispersed in quite remote areas, and it'd be quite common for people to wake up at like 3 in the morning and get on a bus till like 7,
Yes,
get to
yes.
work, then get back on the bus, sleep for like 3-4 hours, and just get back on the bus again. So is that actually true? Is that just a rumor, that kind of thing, or is that exaggerated?
Yes, JP, that's actually accurate. Personally, I have an allowance of 3 hours for commute. When I was working for a local company back in my early days. So I wake up around 4 a.m., 5 a.m., prepare everything, and then get on the bus because bus is the main way to get into the big cities here in the Philippines. So the bus would travel around up 1.5 hours to 2 hours, depending on the traffic. And then that's just for the bus. There are still many, you know, um, transitions to commuting. If you've heard of jeepneys here in the Philippines, uh, it's our local way of transportation, just like tuk-tuk in
Uh-huh.
Thailand. Yeah, so it's our own version of commuting for small alleyways, small roads. So yeah, it's the commute is the worst part of working back in a local company.
Yeah, I hear that, and I'm not surprised at all that it would be attractive to to stay working from home, especially kind of on the family side. One thing that I've noticed over the years of working with different team members and different roles is that there does seem to be different pockets of types of owners, almost say types of workers or demographics within the outsourcing space. One very, very prominent one I found is the kind of Filipino mums. Um, just especially because of the time zone, that if you're working in the UK, maybe you could work while the child is asleep or something like that. And then I feel like you sort of feel into that bracket of slightly younger, maybe have one child or not have children, and come from a kind of university background, graduated, but don't want to go into kind of that work. Is that accurate? And have I missed any other categories that you think
Yes,
exist?
uh, you're you're right on the mark. Majority of the Filipinos that are working from home are, or rather, majority of the moms that can work, through computer opt to work from home because, as you've said, it allows them to spend more time with their families, and it is becoming a norm here in the Philippines if both parents would work remotely but on different time zones to cover, if one is working through the US shift, so that's overnight here in the Philippines, night shift, and then the morning comes, the other partner can work for Australia or even for UK because I think the time there's just an overlap of 1 hour. It allows for the couple to be able to attend to the, if they have a baby or if they're taking care of their parents, old parents. So
It's always surprised me, and it still does surprise me, where it's, how do I even say this? Like, the amount of work, just the amount of time spent working in the culture, it seems, of the Philippines. And I don't know if that's because the cost of living is so high, or it's just there's an opportunity there, or you need it to be able to sustain. But it's very common to have, a household with a man and a woman, both of them maybe working 2 or 3 jobs, and as you just said there, there's maybe like 1 hour or 2 hour overlap where neither are working. is that accurate? Is that, or is that an extreme case? Because I hear it a lot, especially when I'm perhaps interviewing somebody, asking them what their setup is, and for me, it's like, wow, that seems like I would just burn out after, maybe 3 months of doing that. And I would speak to someone and they'd be like, oh no, I've been doing that for 6 years or something like that.
Okay, so I think to put it into perspective is that if you're working for a local company here in the Philippines, you would allot, aside from the 8 hours working time for the office, you would still need to allot probably 6 hours, 5 to 6 hours of commute, plus preparation, plus, everything before you can totally rest, before you can, usually when we go home, you just sleep. So that 5 to 6 hours or probably 7 hours can now be translated into working hours. So it's not very difficult for most Filipinos to adapt to, having more workloads or actively seeking 2 clients, 3 clients,
Yeah.
just to cover, of course, there's a matter of the pay, more clients, more work means more income. But from a cultural perspective, I think we're just more resilient in working, in toiling for more work hours because we see it as an opportunity to get away from the commute, the boredom of the commute, the wasted hours, wasted opportunity.
I was just going to say, is that Monday to Friday? Or are some people also working Saturdays, Sundays, maybe on that one job or maybe 2 different jobs? Generally, are they taking one full day off or?
Majority of the people I know, also in the working, in the virtual assistance industry, is that they are working 7 days if they have multiple clients, but if they're just working for, one client, usually it would just be 5 to 6 days.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
And is there something that, from an employer's point of view, is it basically, is there some way or benefit of an employer trying to have someone work exclusively for them? Because for me, I've done this in the past, even with yourself working with me, and I've expressed it. I've said, look, I'm happy to pay more if you worked exclusively for my company. And that's not because I don't want you to do other things, but it's more just like the distraction and the kind of, mainly the distraction, I think, but also I just know in my situation, if I was on the other side, I just feel like I wouldn't be as productive. So I guess my question is, do you think that like there is value in employers offering that and maybe paying a premium to do that? Or do you think even if you did, people will always want to try and, get other opportunities? And is there something missing? I'm missing there.
I think working from a employer's perspective, getting well, in this case, a Filipino virtual assistant working exclusively for them, as you've said, it removes the distraction factor and the relationship, but mainly getting an exclusive, I would say, employee, just for the sake of the conversation, getting an exclusive employee also gives the employer, I think, the confidence that if it's within working hours, let's say for UK time, you would know that he's only working solely for you, and
Yeah.
any kind of work that you would ask would probably be delivered in a more efficient time rather than active, at the back of your mind, or probably if this is an agreed setup, is that if your Filipino virtual assistant has multiple clients, there's a possibility that you are being set aside, especially if your rate or your pay is lower in comparison to the other clients. So getting a premium probably gives, from the perspective of the Filipino, it gives you priority over the other, probably housework or other task here and here. Yeah.
And I think there's something to be said there, just to, like, from personal experience, that there must be a kind of feeling of job security or lack of it, and potentially, let me get a couple of other clients just in case this one doesn't kind of stick by, because the nature of the work you do, you know, basically you could be told tomorrow that's it, or even the same day that's it. So is there something that from an employer's point of view can be done to give some security that you know, the job has some, you know, long term to it, so you don't feel like you got to go out and get more clients or anything like that?
Well, personally, think that having I would say a middleman, or in our personal case, having Upwork as the middleman to serve as, you know, if the employer suddenly vanishes, or the employee suddenly vanishes, there's a safety net, because I think Upwork compensates the other party depending on, you know, if they're verified and other factors that you've complied to them. Majority of the Filipinos are actually scared of the thing that you said, of suddenly having no work, suddenly being dispatched, or, you know, we're not just needed anymore. So having multiple clients definitely helps with alleviating the fear of going out without work. But I think just having a contract, even though it's just on paper, it relieves somewhat a little of the fear, especially from Filipino side, because from our perspective, we're looking for clients because we want income, and the income and the salary, it comes only probably after 15 days or 30 days, depending on the setup. The risk is, I would say the risk is higher from the Filipino employees, from the Filipino virtual workers, because they tend to work for 15 days. Probably they've delivered some, you know, some value already to the client, probably with cold calling or managing of the inbox or whatever virtual tasks they've assigned to. It could be done in the 15 days, and then suddenly the employer vanishes. Personally, I saw many, or I've read many situations, very similar situations, in our groups here in the Philippines, where the employer suddenly not responding anymore, or even removing access to the files. So it is definitely a realistic fear working virtually.
It's interesting there that you say that the contracts, because that's something that everybody can do in terms of employers, and it just gives a sense of intentions and clarity, I think, more than anything. Did you have a question?
My question was actually the same, actually, about sort of having multiple people to hedge. But I was thinking just about, on that same thing, is there much of a culture, or is it even possible for Filipinos to save? Are they kind of saving in the event that a employer might just disappear, or is that not really something they do, a possibility?
I think the general trend lately is that majority of the Filipinos are now saving, having more income, having more employers or clients. It forced the general trend lately for Filipinos to save, because I think when the opportunity to work remotely opened up 2 to 3 years ago, the industry is not yet saturated, meaning that there are less Filipino workers but more clients. But the trend lately, there are lots of Filipinos but less clients. The fear of not getting an actual client, or maybe when they do get a client, the fear of losing that exact client, it forces the general trend to majority of us to save, rather than when it was still new, the opportunity to work remotely was still new. I saw many posts, I've read so many stories of them flaunting their, new iPhones, new laptops, because generally working for a foreign client tends to give more salary in comparison to the local salaries in the Philippines. So majority of those early adopters have had the opportunity to buy, I would say, luxury items.
Yeah. And there's no welfare provisions in the Philippines, is there? So if you don't have a job, the government's not giving you any money, are they?
No. There's.
You mentioned these groups. How did you find out about them? And also, I'm interested to know, from a kind of like social perspective, having moved from working within the like commuting, that takes your time and whatnot, but there's a certain social element that's gone. What do you do, and have these groups replaced that?
Okay, so I think my first interaction with working remotely, because I think in my circle of friends, I'm the first one to adapt working remotely. There's really no local influence over me other than the social media. Mainly, I think, to be exact, it was TikTok that introduced me to working virtually. I saw a lot of posts. They said that they're earning six figures. Six figures in Philippines is probably around, if I convert it to pounds, it would be probably around pounds. So for us, that's a large sum of money. So these influencers, they're flaunting their money. They saying that they're earning six digits a month working remotely. And then they will flex, as I've said earlier, they would flex all their purchases, iPhone, laptops, new house, whatever. But mainly it was TikTok that became the first thing to penetrate my environment of working traditionally, then transition to a working remotely, and then suddenly my Instagram and then my Facebook, actively seeking out similar situations. Everyone is saying the same, that they're earning this amount of money. They have more time, especially. That's the thing that attracted me. They have no more time with their families, and then there's no more commute. So it was mainly the influence of social media that's propagated.
And that's how you got into those groups. And once now you're doing it, because as Arthur was saying, like there's also an element of when you're on site or when you're in the site office, you're having jokes and you're meeting people, and there's that social like banter side of it, which you probably don't have now. Is that just like secondary to you? Is it just like, well, now I can be at home and I don't have to commute, or do you miss that? And is there something that, again, maybe an employer could do to facilitate that? Or, because I remember we used to kind of try and coordinate, you guys in the Philippines to go for drinks and stuff like that. But how important is that sort of stuff?
I guess from I would say in the early phase of me transitioning from a traditional company to working from home, I didn't expect that the lonely factor, because previously, since I'm working on site, I mainly coordinate with lots of people, having jokes with my colleagues, everything, my contractors. So transitioning from that very social environment to a very, I would say, solitary situation. Even though I'm with my family, the difference is very apparent. I didn't know that the loneliness, or I would say depression, would sink that deeply, that I would crave for human interaction, crave for friends, crave for just people outside of my family. Maybe from a early adapter or early, I would say, newbies, or someone who will transition from the traditional environment, they would definitely feel that lonely factor for quite a while before they do get to fully adapt to, I'm just alone now. Although I can still see my friends, I can still talk to them. It would be less because there's no more forced factor of going out to the work and then afterwards going for drinks with them. So yeah, it was definitely a starting.
Can you pinpoint any particular things or suggestions that you think an employer could implement? One, to prevent that feeling and create some connection, but two, if they are feeling that perhaps one of their overseas team are having these issues, like what could a builder do on the other side of the world to make you feel a little bit more connected to the impact you're having, or like that kind of stuff?
Okay. Two main things comes to mind. So one is the team building, which I've previously proposed when I was working for you back then, because I think having a team building, it forces, again, we're going back to the force thing. It forces us, basically the Filipinos, to interact, to meet our coworkers forcefully, and then from that kind of forced environment, it would help us to fully know the people that we are working with, rather than just seeing them from the screen, hearing them from the speaker or the headphones.
Yeah.
There's a factor of reality. I'm talking to a person now, and then you will see their quirks, you will see their habits, and then how it translates to their working habit. You will notice those things. If you can jive, or if you can get along with a certain person, obviously it will manifest when working together. The other thing is for employers to consider renting a co-working space probably once a month, depending on the frequency that they would want it. The purpose is there are working remotely. There's a factor of items or conversations or tasks being delayed, because maybe when I'm working right now, the other one is prioritizing the other thing. So it creates a delay in between, rather than working on the same spot, on the same office. You'll be able to push for the other person to prioritize your thing. Recreating the environment of the traditional working at office is also beneficial, but it's not good for a long term. I would or say I don't like the co-working space to be a regular thing, because it defeats the
Yeah.
purpose of working from home. It's just probably once a month or twice a
It's
month
got
thing.
its time and place kind of thing.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I want to move the conversation a little bit over to your journey in understanding the specifics of a construction market on the other side of the world. You come from a construction background, in terms of both education and on site, but every country has different regulations, different terminology, and things like that. And I know now for a few years you've been focused on the UK market, so I want you to kind of rewind back a bit to when you first started, kind of in that kind of 2019. How was it going into it, like trying to get your head around what was going on? And in hindsight, is there anything that both you and your kind of employer or employee, if you had multiple companies you were working for, could have done to help accelerate that process?
Okay, so I think since there's a very stark difference between the building methodology here in the Philippines of rebars using cement, and then transitioning to a UK standard of type of building, like with battens, mainly with woods, mainly with timber and plasterboards. There's a factor of intimidation starting to work with zero knowledge for a foreign company, which I think is a very normal thing to experience. If it's not exclusive to working for UK, but just working for a foreign company in a different industry. Ultimately, it's really up to the employee, to the Filipino virtual assistant, to catch up basically with the knowledge as much as he can before working directly, before being put on the spot. Because I think knowledge is free, especially with the internet age. They can watch YouTube. There's a lot of things in YouTube. They can even read books, online books. So I would say percentage-wise, there's a 70 to 80% responsibility coming from the employee or for the Filipino to catch up with the things. And the remaining would be help from the employers, because as you've said earlier, if there are things that the employer can help to speed up the things of adjustment, or to help with the knowledge, to bring up the knowledge up to speed, then maybe prepare the necessary materials ahead of time. Because as I've said earlier, in YouTube or in the internet space, there's a lot you can learn, but probably 30 to 40% of those items are irrelevant to the actual work. So I would say streamlining the information from the employer directly to the employee would definitely help speed up with the transition, the catching up, adjustment.
So you sort of, again, from an employer side, because most of the listeners of this will be from that side. If I understood it correctly, it was kind of you're saying it would help if you as the employer could look at the information that's available for free and just tell the Filipino person, the contractor, which is relevant, which is not, and kind of do that work, so you're not spending wasted time looking at things. And I guess that could probably be a bit confusing as well if you've got the contractor, the employer telling you one way of doing things, and then you've watched a YouTube video that says it's slightly different or something like that. In terms of the characteristics of before the video went live, and maybe we'll bring that section into the video. I said working with Filipinos is my favorite of all the different nationalities of people that I've worked with. I wanted to touch on some of the factors that I think attracts me to the culture of working with you guys, and I'd love to hear a little bit from your point of view of whether you agree with that, and if you think that there's some reason why that's happened. And then I'd also love to get into some of the kind of maybe challenges that you do have of working with UK and American companies. So one thing for me I'd have to say is the language. The language really stands out, as it feels like you guys from a younger age than maybe other countries have been able to kind of grasp the English language, and the slang and things like that. Even though I look at Filipino and I'm like, I don't even know what, I see you guys type sometimes. I'm like, I don't even know. Well, it doesn't sound anything similar, but it's quite amazing that, so many people in the Philippines have such a good grasp of English. The second thing I'd say is the culture is very similar in terms of the lifestyle, the slang that you're using, the kind of the jokes, and I generally have found it's easier to kind of just have a social conversation with somebody in that setting than maybe some other people from other countries. And lastly, and we touched on this definitely, is that kind of the work ethic. I haven't found. One thing I found consistent is that there's just like this minimum standard of work ethic, which really, really helps, when you can, if you get the right person in the right role as a Filipino, you can get a huge amount of productivity and commitment from them that maybe you might struggle with to have is in an in-house employment kind of thing. So could you touch on a little bit about whether you think that's accurate, where you think that comes from, and maybe if you wanted to sell your country more, and whether you think there's any other traits that you think are worth highlighting that maybe I've just taken for granted because I've just been around you guys so much.
Yes. So to be direct, all three items that you mentioned actually correct. So the first one, we were taught at a very young age, probably we call it elementary phase of our education. So it's from 6 years old up to 12 years old. English is actually a part of our curriculum. There's no way out of it. So even though you will see illiterate, I wouldn't say illiterate, but you would see people that haven't finished their degree, really, really poor families, they can still speak English, even though it's a little bit broken, because they've learned it at a young age from free public schools. So, you will see 95% to 98% of the Filipinos actually speak English. So it's really easy for us to work internationally, obviously for English-speaking clients. So yes, that's actually one of our perks. Second is, I think, your second point is, I think, culturally, I'm not sure if it's known internationally, but Filipinos are very hospitable, very accommodating. We really try to keep the mood very, very light. We try to have a very friendly conversation, very friendly environment, because it's actually deep within our culture to be accepting of different, a very good example of it is when I would say, if there's a birthday party here in the Philippines, one household is a birthday family, birthday celebrant, they would tend to invite everyone in the neighborhood, even though they don't know them. That's actually part of our culture. So when Filipinos internationally in abroad, they tend to invite their workmates, which aren't Filipinos, everyone in the neighborhood, everyone in the workplace, because they want to be on the good side of everyone. We try to avoid conflict. We tend to be indirect with our complaints or things like that. So it would be easier for us to lean on the having a very jolly side, very light environment over a very strict working relationship with with a very strict suffocating environment. So yeah. The third point, I think, can you refresh me on the third point?
Is about the pretty consistent work ethic, or
Yes.
it's almost, I want to say almost like the base level of work ethic and expectations upon themselves is just like quite significantly higher than I might experience as a base level here in the UK, or as perhaps going to a different country as well.
I think what propels most Filipinos to do our best working directly with our clients is the fear of losing the client. Because from our perspective, the supply and demand of virtual workers is dwindling. There's a lot of supply of Filipino workers right now, and there are lot less of clients. So of course, there's a factor of the culture of us working really hard, but mainly it the factors that are propelling us to have, as you said, a minimum baseline of being really good at the work given to us is the fear of losing the client's trust, and then in transition losing the main income of the family. Although it is fine to work for a local company, there would probably be a lot more of reasons to work for remotely for foreign clients. I mean, there's a lot of advantage rather than working for traditional ones. So there's a toxic culture here in the Philippines uh, of a higher up giving a lot of work that's outside of the job description of I'm speaking of the traditional of the local companies. There's a toxic way of culture in the Philippines that there are a lot of tasks being given to an employee that's outside of their job description, and I would say they're being held hostage because this would reflect very badly on your performance, or if you don't accept this work, then you'd be probably put to you'll be removed from the company. So it's mainly fear of us not delivering to a very high standard that's propelling us to offer it to our international clients.
I mean, you mentioned it there, and I've certainly experienced it where I've found it to be more challenging for, and not so much you, but for generally any outsourced kind of overseas worker to go into kind of conflict and handle conflict situations. And I've always been curious as to where that comes from, because obviously on your building sites back in the Philippines, like if a subcontractor's done a shit job, you need to tell them, and I'm sure you would tell them you've done a shit job. But I found that it's kind of like it's just harder, and I couldn't put my finger on whether it was because you've never met a subcontractor, so it's hard to tell them virtually you're doing a shit job, or whether it's because this person's maybe white or something. Maybe there's something that comes into play with that stuff.
Yes.
Or if it's like you don't want to say the wrong thing and you don't know where your boundaries are. But I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that kind of area, and again how as an employer you can kind of work with somebody to kind of get them in that role, because really that's ideally where for an outsourced contractor to kind of step into really helping the employer, you want them to be able to take on the hard situations, do the management type of stuff, so it's more of a benefit to the company.
So regarding that point, I think I have two main reasons, or two main answers. One of which is it's related to my answer earlier, where we try to keep the mood very, very light, even though in very hostile situations. we really try to avoid conflict as much as possible. It's deep within our culture. It's not very specific to just a person being afraid of confrontation. Probably on the other side of the coin, probably it's because of our toxic culture of not being direct with the person we're addressing to, but somehow we're backstabbing him. There's a culture of backstabbing, of talking behind the person to get even. So maybe that's part of the influence in being avoidant of direct confrontation. My second point is that as you know, Philippines is a third world country. Majority of or general consensus here in the Philippines, especially if you do a very specific study of our demographic, you will notice that 60% or 70% of our population is Jose. So we have a general mindset of uh, white people, foreign people. They are better than us, social status, money wise, basically higher specs. I'm saying this very carefully because it's one of the things that we want to remove, but basically because of the general population of not everyone is very educated to put themselves in a situation where they can consider other people as their equal. The general consensus is now leaning towards if there's a white visitor in the Philippines, they're automatically better. We should serve them better. We should be very, very polite with them, even though they're rude to us. Not slave thing mindset, but basically social inequality type of stuff. So working internationally or working virtually for foreign clients, there's a lot of adjustment for Filipino workers to, if their employer is demanding for a very direct conversation or confrontation, it tends to be picked up. But again, it's an adjustment part from our end.
Is there anything that, again, from a company point of view, an owner point of view, or maybe even just a manager directing you from, and I'm not white myself, and I actually think when obviously the color plays a part, but there's also kind of just like a first world country person speaking to a third world country, that kind of dynamic. So let's take the color out for a second here, but is there something that we could do to make you feel more at ease with that? Or do you think that that's just something that's just ingrained and it's like a probably multi-generational thing, and a very complex thing that to because sometimes it's just we just have to acknowledge it and understand it and just be aware of it as in the employer, and that's kind of all we can do, but that actually has a big impact. But I'm just curious whether there's also actual active things and approaches that can be taken.
Definitely. I think one of the things I've requested to you previously is that if we can have probably a seminar or workshop regarding de-escalating frustrated clients, or how do we address, these angry clients without affecting the reputation of the company, or, without breaking down any working relationship with them. I think we have here in the Philippines, but mostly it's not for foreign clients, but mostly it's for call centers, any kind of work that demands client interface, client resolution. That's one of the things personally I think would help the employee to adjust to that kind of confrontational stuff. The other thing is basically there's no way to put it than directly jumping into the fire, because I think experience is still the best teacher, and no amount of workshop, virtual knowledge can help you when you're really hearing the clients shout through the phone, or saying bad things to you and the company. So unfortunately, other than workshop and maybe having a very consistent communication directly with the employee, coming from the perspective of the employer, there's really no way of speeding things up rather than just putting them directly on the situation.
If I was to critique myself, I would say I am certainly guilty of. I think there's several situations where I've said, "Oh fuck it, Fred, you deal with that." Like I can't be bothered, and honestly, it's so personal. I'm just like, I just don't have the time. I don't want the energy of that, and I think that's probably the wrong way. If I'm honest, like that's too much. Where do you think is a good balance of like hand holding but then preventing the learning from you as the the person that's not experiencing that conflict. And what, as I said, I'm probably more prone to do, which is just throw you in and see if you survive, kind of thing.
So yeah, I think my point of being directly put on the situation actually came from our early working relationship, because I think when I came to the working with you, we have one contractor that's working very messily with multiple clients at the same time. One of the things that really helped me adjust to that kind of confrontational stuff is when we have these 1 hour phone calls or meetings ahead of the scheduled call directly with the client, with you guiding me on the certain points that needs to be discussed and not stray away from those points. That really helped me have a clear goal or clear direction with the upcoming confrontation. Of course, there's a majority of those situations will really depend on the employee, in his ability to handle the situation. But from the benefit or let's say this, the value that can be added from the employer side is being very clear on what needs to be discussed ahead of the time and actually having the solution ready. I think we've had multiple calls where you already provided the resolution, but you want to see how it will play out before we deliver those solutions to the client. So, if option A is not good, then option B. I think that's a good way of letting the employee understand that the confrontation is not really an attack on the employee himself or on the company, but rather on the situation that built up, that arises from the, probably from the construction in our case.
So I had a couple of points on this to ask about something related to, this whole the conflict resolution type stuff. One thing, because a lot of the stuff you were just explaining with JP giving you kind of a rundown beforehand, scenarios, how much of a difference does it make when the business you're working with is organized in that way and forward thinking? Because you must have come across situations where they're asking you to do stuff, they're not organized, they don't even know what they want from you, and they're just like, just go and do this job, and you're like, you haven't told me how to do it. There's no process here. You haven't, is that a common thing for you?
Yes, I've already experienced a situation, very similar situation with another foreign client, another construction company in UK, where they're not organized. They don't have clear goals, rather other than getting clients. There's no process of how to build relationship with the clients or how do we get information out of them. Mostly they just provided contact. They have a general idea of the thing that the client would want to be built. There's no other, how do I say it? Again, there's no process of how to get to step 3. There's no step 1 and step 2. They just immediately focus on the goal. So it's really hard for the employees, which especially in those kinds of situations, us the 80% and 90% of the work. So that kind of situation, or that kind of way of working tends to deliver very different outcomes for a large number of clients, because again, there's no way of sticking to the process. Thus, the brand of the company is being removed from the equation. So having a very good, clear standard, having a good direction beforehand tends to help even in confrontational situations when things get to worst. There's already a problem arising from the construction or in any kind of service.
Do you think it's a case of, like, if a company is in that state and they think they want to employ somebody from overseas, would you suggest, well, take a step back and get clear on what you're doing? Or do you think it's more just about them acknowledging, still hiring, but acknowledging what it is that they want from you, and the fact that they don't have a clear process, and ask you to help create that process at the same time. Like, what do you think is a better approach?
I think the second one is the better approach, because by having the employer very transparent on what he needs, he gets to select a more appropriate Filipino worker to help him with his endeavors. In situations where probably a startup company, if the employer didn't mention that he is still a startup company or a very new to this kind of role, and he just hires probably a very cheap, I would say cheap in terms of rate, a very cheap Filipino worker, then they tend to have, this very disorganized type of work environment. So it's very important for employers to be very transparent. They can admit it to the employee that I do not have specific knowledge of, creating a process. Maybe you have experience. So the Filipino worker would then be in reciprocation. We will also be very transparent that we will tell you if we have knowledge. Same way that I told you, JP, that I don't have really good knowledge on estimating, but you still hired me. And then it turns up to be, a thing that we've continued for more than a year. So being very clear from the start tends to deliver more advantageous situation, and it allows for more brainstorming rather than setting a very high expectations for the Filipino worker to go beyond his job description, and for on the other side of the coin, the Filipino worker having a very high expectation with the employee of having a good process, having a very streamlined procedures. So yeah, the second one's definitely a better option.
Do you think, and this actually relates in a way to the conflict thing, because what you're talking about there is a relationship with the employer and things like that. Do you ever feel like maybe you don't want to get into these conflicts because actually, we're talking about construction, you've got, say, who's employing you, you've got the contractor, and you just think, I'm just this disposable person that they're just employing to make calls, or they're just employing me to do this thing. Is there any element of that where you think, I can't say the wrong thing because I'm the one that he'll get rid of first? Especially if you don't have that relationship. Is there that feeling in the back of your mind?
Yes, there definitely is. It's also stemmed to our culture of keeping the work environment very light, because we tend to stay away from any kind of situation. So perhaps a very good example is that us Filipino workers, a Filipino virtual assistant working for JP, we usually ask him if the situation is is getting out of hand. Is there a way we can say these things to the client without, harming you or harming the company's image, reputation? Because we're very scared to do irreversible damage and then being immediately disposed of, because as I've said earlier, there's a lot of supplies of Filipino virtual assistants. So from our perspective, we are definitely disposable, and we know that if we tend to keep a scoreboard internally, as Filipinos, we tend to keep a scoreboard of us making mistakes, and we notice that we're committing a lot of mistakes, then we're starting to get scared, being cut off. We're starting to be disorganized because the fear is catching up to us. Because again, we're working from a social standpoint, or from working from a third world country, we see ourselves in a lower position already. So there's a factor of us needing to appease you with good results consistently. So having a bad results or having confrontations, we are being, we try to stay away from those because we don't want to be associated with it.
We went pretty deep today in today's conversation. I thought it's funny. I thought it's going to be a really good tips and tricks. Here's 10 tips of what to do, and it's ended up being kind of I feel like a kind of mindset and different perspective of things. But I do think that it would be even for myself, but for any other employers listening to this, sometimes just a change of mindset and a different awareness can actually just have a big impact in terms of maybe just even your language, certain approaches, certain expectations and things like that. So I've really, really enjoyed this conversation, Fred.